Good morning and welcome. I'm Steve Bacon, the Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Education, and I'm welcoming you here today. I'm very pleased to open this panel discussion on the legacy of Dr. King, which kicks off a full day honoring the life and legacy of this great man. Like many who will attend today's events, Dr. King is a hero and inspiration to me. He was one of the great moral leaders like Gandhi or Mandela, whose movements changed their countries for good. Like the biblical prophets of his faith tradition, King comforted the afflicted and afflicted the comfortable. 50 years later, our country is in a better place, but there are still many people who need comfort and justice, and others, myself included, who need some afflicting to shake their complacency. Dr. King gave us hope, reminding us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Of course, it doesn't bend by itself. It's through the hard work and sacrifice of individuals fighting together for justice that the arc bends. I hope today's events will bring us awe and gratitude for the many changes we've seen in the 50 years since Dr. King and the inspiration to keep bending. And now, here's Dr. Alem Kabidi, Professor of Sociology and moderator of today's panel.
Thanks a lot, Dean Bacon. Thank you for coming. We have 4 presentations today. So before I do that, what I would like to bring to your attention is that since we have today the drill at 10 o'clock, 10:30, I think we'll have a break. We have no choice. So we'll have the 4 presentations first, between 15 and 20 minutes. And then after the 4 presentations, we'll have a break, 15, 20. And then when we come back, we'll have a question and answer session. Okay, so first of all, I would like to really appreciate and give thanks to my colleagues here. I asked them to be part of this panel discussion, and then they said yes. Thank you very much for that. So as I mentioned earlier, we will have 4 presentations. So since we don't have much time, we will start the presentation. So the first presentation will be by Professor Patricia Henry. The title of her presentation would be Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. I lived it. Excuse me. Professor Patricia Henry was born and raised in Topeka, Kansas. She moved to Bakersfield in 1999 to teach at CSUB. She is a senior founding faculty of the Masters in Social Work program at California State University, Bakersfield, and past Director of Field Education. She holds a BA degree in social work from Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas, and master's degree in social work from the University of Kansas in Lawrence. She previously taught in MSW program at Washburn University, the MSW program at the University of Kansas, and BSW program at Kansas State University. Her areas of expertise are in child and family services, clinical practice, cultural sensitivity, and gangs and gang violence, use and adapters. She has completed some research in the area of the impact of gangs in the community and the collaboration of community with gangs and law enforcement to help toward gang violence in the Bakersfield-Kern County area. Prior to moving to Bakersfield, California, she founded the Douglas Project, Phoenix Community Gang Task Force in Lawrence, Kansas, and spent a wealth of time educating the schools, law enforcement, and the community at large on gang prevention and intervention. This area is still one of her passions. She is a past member of the National Association of Social Works and Council on Social Work Education and the Kern County Methamphetamine Task Force. She sits on the community board of and remains involved with the Bakersfield Safe Streets Partnership and facilitates cultural sensitivity trainings for the Alliance Against Family Violence and Sexual Assault, Koinonia Foster Family Agency, and other agencies as requested. Please welcome Professor Patricia Henry.
Good morning and thank you. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren handed down a unanimous vote, 9-0, to desegregate the schools in the United States of America. One of those primary individuals involved in that lawsuit, because it was a large lawsuit, it was a class action lawsuit, which many people don't know, was Linda Brown. Born and raised right there in Topeka, Kansas. So we always called it Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education versus what you will see when you do your research. It just says Brown v. Education. I grew up in Topeka. I was born in 1953. When the ruling occurred, and I want you all to be very cognizant of that, it occurred on May 17, 1954, that was just 64 years ago. Sit with that for a minute. And I ask you to do that because many people are struggling with the Black Lives Matter movement and those kinds of things and saying that's past history, some of this stuff is way far back there. It's not that far removed. I lived it. All right. When I started kindergarten, which was in 1958, hear that, the ruling was done in 1954. The caveat, though, was there was no instructions given on how to implement the integration piece. So in 1955, another component of that hearing came down that we don't hear a lot about, and it was called Brown 2. And that was where the Supreme Court stated that this country must desegregate, quote, with all deliberate speed, end quote. That still didn't tell you when. So many of the white schools across this country drug their heels and drug themselves kicking and screaming into integration. Topeka, Kansas was no different. When I started kindergarten, there were still 18 all-white schools, but only 8 of them were listed in the lawsuit. They were Clay Elementary, Gage Elementary, Lafayette Elementary, Lowman Hill, Parkdale, Quincy, and Randolph and Sumner. I'm going to talk about Parkdale because that's where I ended up having to go to school. Again, all of it happened and was done in the courts by 1955. In 1958, I started kindergarten. They redrew the district lines. Had I walked out my back door, across the alley, through Mr. Searcy's backyard, and across the street, I would have been at the all-black school. Instead, when they redrew the district lines, my front door took me 5 blocks to the all-white school. I was in kindergarten, I didn't care. I just wanted to go to school and hang out and play. So, I didn't know why my mother walked me to school every morning. Every morning. She would put on her uniform. Before she went to work, she would walk me to school. And I didn't know why there were police officers in the parking lot, why there were whites hanging on the fence that we went through calling me a nigger. I remember telling my mother, that's a bad word. What's wrong with those big people? And her response was, just ignore them. I will always get you to school safe. So, she marches me into the school building, and I had my teacher, Mrs. Davis. This ought to tell you something. I remember this woman from day one. And why? Because she kept me in her lap. I was the only black kid for 6 weeks at Parkdale Elementary School. Every time there was recess, she kept me beside her, held my hand. I didn't get to play with the other kids because there were people, dogs, law enforcement trying to maintain. You had racial epithets. You had this little kid being called a bitch, and I hope I'm not offending anyone. I just want to be real. And a nigger, and a nigger bitch. Every day, I went to school through these crowds of people. And my mother was only 5'2". She'll swear she was 5'3", but she was only 5'2". And she walked me through that massive crowd of people every day and delivered me from hand, literally to hand, to my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Davis. In the classroom, I sat in her lap. My kindergarten picture has me sitting in her lap. When it was time to play with crayons and clay, I sat in her lap. Because the other kids would call me a nigger because my mommy said you were. My mommy said you stink. My mommy said you were dirty. We can't play with you. So she kept me in her lap. And finally, along comes Cynthia Douglas, Joyce Blackwell, Michael Lawrence, and there were 2 others that I can't remember. And doggone it, there were 6 of us in that room. And so we had this little group that we would go over in the corner and play. When it was time for recess, she had us hold hands, she took us outside and told us which part of the playground we could play on, so we could be watched if she wasn't the playground teacher by her. If she was the playground teacher, one of the other teachers would come and stand beside us while we played. We really didn't intermingle hardly at all. I want to say until closer to Christmas, when it was time for the Christmas pageant and we all had to sing together. So, what I remember about kindergarten isn't quite what you all probably remember about kindergarten. I didn't understand what that was all about until I took a Black history course when I was 15. So 10 years later, I found out about Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. And it gets better. I found out that the minister of my church was the man that started that, Reverend Brown. And I found out that his daughter that babysat me, Linda Brown, was the catalyst for that. So when I tell you I lived it, I breathed it, I finally learned about it, and I finally began to understand what it meant to walk in my skin. Has it changed? A little bit. Compliments of the gentleman you see over my shoulder. He fought a hard struggle for us to get where we are. But I've still been called a nigger as recently as last summer in San Luis Obispo at the beach. I've still been called a nigger sitting right here on this campus the day after the elections, and a lady was getting off the bus and I smiled at everybody. And she told me, keep my smile to myself, nigger. Has it changed? Has the pendulum swung forward or backwards? I don't want answers, I just want you to sit with that. And while you're sitting with that, remember I lived it. And remember that unless you walk in my skin, you may never understand it. You'll feel it, and I appreciate that from the bottom of my heart. But you may never truly understand it. So when some Black person tells you, until you walk a mile in my shoes, don't placate me, please don't be offended. Because what they're really trying to say is, we appreciate you and your understanding as far as you can take it, but you'll never totally understand. Because no one will ever call you a nigger and you have to hear it all the time echo in your head. Linda Brown's lawsuit paved the way for integration in Topeka, Kansas, and across this country. By the time the case was settled, Linda was in junior high and never got to go to the school she fought to go to. And as of Sunday, March 25th, 2018, Linda Brown passed away. But she left a legacy, and here I sit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. Professor Henry is, this would be her last semester here at CSUB. She's retiring. Congratulations.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Dr. Mary Stango. The title of her presentation is Women, Gender, and the Long Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Mary Stango is Assistant Professor of History at California State University, Bakersfield, and is a historian of gender, race, slavery, and emancipation in the 19th century United States and Atlantic world. She received her PhD in history from the University of Michigan in 2006. She has received fellowships and awards from the Library Company of Philadelphia and the Massachusetts Historical Society, among other institutions, and was the recipient of an American Fellowship from the American Association for University Women. Currently, she is at work on a book manuscript tentatively titled Vine and Palm Tree, African American Families in Liberia, 1820-1860, which explores the role women and diasporic families played in the settlement of colonial and early Republic Liberia. In her examination of sources from the US and Liberia, she argues that settlers both reconstituted and redefined the meaning of kinship after their experience of American slavery and transformed the requirements and impulses of the American colonization movement. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the organizers of all of the events today. Today, I'll be talking about women, gender, and the long civil rights movement. Oh, they can't hear me. Is that better? No. No? Any better now? Yes. Okay, fabulous. So in any case, I'll be talking about women, gender, and the long civil rights movement, trying to bring together some of the recent work that's been done by scholars on women in the civil rights movement who often sort of fall out of the master narrative of the movement. So I'll begin. At the 2018 Golden Globes, as she accepted the Cecil B. DeMille Award, Oprah Winfrey invoked the name of Recy Taylor. Taylor, who had died just 10 days before Winfrey's speech, was a name that was new to many following along at home. Winfrey told Taylor's story to them. Taylor was a wife and a young mother who attended Rock Hill Holiness Church in Abbeville, Alabama. In September 1944, Taylor was walking home from the church when 7 white men in a Chevrolet pulled to the side of the road and forced her into the car. After driving off of the road, 6 of the men raped Taylor, blindfolded her, and left her on the side of the road. Taylor reported to the police what had happened to her and identified her assailants by the car that they had driven. Despite admitting to what they, the men, stated was intercourse with Taylor, her assailants were never arrested. In Montgomery, 90 miles away, the local NAACP branch heard about Taylor's story. Rosa Parks, secretary of the chapter, traveled to Abbeville to meet with Taylor. Taylor's choice to bear testimony and publicize the violence she endured was a critical one, and it was a path that African American women had chosen since the dawn of emancipation. As historian Kadada Williams has recently shown, Black women who endured sexualized violence following the Civil War testified in front of federal agents and to the court system to demand justice and protection. Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching crusader and journalist who helped organize the NAACP in 1909, wrote prolifically about the true threat to Southern women, the rape of Black women by white men. When Taylor testified to her pain and demanded justice, she was tapping into a long history of Black women's activism against sexual violence. And in talking with Recy Taylor, Rosa Parks built upon her own experiences as the granddaughter of Garveyites who preached self-determination, and as an NAACP activist who raised money for the defense of the Scottsboro Boys in 1931. Building on the years of activism in Alabama's Black communities, in 1944, Taylor and Parks planned their course of action. And in response to her investigation, Parks formed the Committee for Equal Justice, a precursor to the Montgomery Improvement Association that would, 11 years later, launch the bus boycott that propelled Martin Luther King, then a high school student in Atlanta, to fame. Oprah Winfrey's retelling of Recy Taylor's story resonates in our present moment. In the era of #MeToo, a movement founded by activist Tarana Burke to promote the empowerment through empathy, Taylor's story reveals the double depression Black women have endured throughout American history. For historians, Recy Taylor and Rosa Parks' activism are potent correctives to a historical narrative that has long sidelined the histories of Black women in the civil rights movement. However, Historically, throughout the long struggle for civil rights, Black women have been at the forefront of demands for justice. Yet, myths about Rosa Parks being a tired old lady who one day decided not to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus prevail. The historical record must be, and indeed has been, corrected. Still, the work of academics has not always seamlessly translated into popular knowledge, hence the thousands of people who Googled Recy Taylor's name, a name most had not heard before, following Oprah Winfrey's speech. Winfrey's retelling of Recy Taylor's story is an outgrowth of recent historical scholarship on the civil rights movement that seeks to place the ordinary people who comprised the vast majority of activists in the movement at the center. It is now clear that Recy Taylor's case was critical to Parks's decades-long engagement with civil rights struggles. Understanding Parks's long history of activism before the bus boycott requires an understanding of the long, and I'm emphasizing long here, civil rights movement. And when I teach my students about the movement, I often introduce them to this idea by asking them to reflect on when they think the movement starts and when they think it ends, right? And typically we hear about Montgomery, and they put the end date right about 1968 for very obvious reasons. But then I introduced them to an idea first articulated by historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall, right? That instead, to understand the civil rights movement, we need to understand what's happening in the 1930s, 1940s, and also what's happening in the 1970s and with the Black Power movement, that after King's assassination, the civil rights movement did not end. In fact, it endured. So with this new reframing, with this long civil rights movement in mind, historical actors who've typically been left out of the story, people like Recy Taylor, pre-Montgomery Rosa Parks, they tend to come to the forefront. Another way that I ask my students to do this is when we talk about the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I asked them who was in the crowd of the 250,000 people who were present there that day, and to, instead of focusing our attention on who was on stage, but to reflect looking back into the crowds of people gathered there. And how does our understanding of that watershed event in United States history change when we look at the crowd rather than to the stage? Is it that history, and in particular the history of women in the movement, that I want to highlight today? And I should mention there's, of course, many, many books that have been written on this subject and many things that I could say. So what I'm about to talk about really barely scratches the surface of women's involvement in the movement. So I've already described how Parks had long nourished her commitment to the civil rights struggle throughout the 30s and 40s. Yet her and her contemporaries were actually instructed by an older generation of activists, and most notably Septima Clark. Clark was born to working-class parents in Charleston, South Carolina. She became a teacher on the Sea Islands, which are just off of the coast. This is a community that has been historically isolated from the mainland and the incubator of what we know today as the Gullah culture. Her experiences as a teacher there in the 1910s, including adult education, people who had been born into slavery or were the children of slaves and wished to know how to read and write. Through most of the South in the time of slavery, teaching slaves to read and write, actually any African American to read and write, was typically considered a crime. So people wanted to learn to read and write. There, she also joined her local chapter of the NAACP and successfully challenged a Charleston law that prevented teachers from teaching in the city's public schools, African American teachers from teaching in the public schools. And this was the approach the NAACP took throughout the early half of the 20th century, legal challenges to Jim Crow segregation. Clark is best known for her work, however, in the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee and establishing subsequent citizenship schools throughout the South. Highlander was founded in 1932 as a way to help working-class Appalachians achieve self-sufficiency through education. By the 1950s, the school was focused on the education of civil rights leaders and was an interracial setting. The idea was to nurture leaders of the new generation, and that these leaders could share these experiences with one another at Highlander and design mechanisms to encourage the participation and leadership of others. So Clark first attended a workshop in 1954 and then helped spread the news about the school's offerings to other activists. A few months before Parks's well-known act of civil disobedience on the Montgomery bus, she had attended a workshop led by Clark, in which she was hoping to learn more about encouraging young people to take on an active role in the NAACP Youth Council. So here we can see this older generation of women activists and teachers mentoring the younger generation of Parks. I should also mention Clark was fired from her job as a teacher for her involvement in the NAACP, yet she continued her work. She worked a lot on the Sea Islands, attempting to register voters. One of the ways that many southern towns and cities attempted to prevent African Americans from voting was through literacy tests, which were really tests on the state constitution, sort of asking, can you recite Article 6, Clause 3 of the Alabama State Constitution? Can you spell all these words correctly? So what she did is she established schools on these Sea Islands to try to teach people to pass these literacy tests so that they could register to vote. And she had her first class of 14. The majority of the people in the class were women, 11 of them were women. 8 of them successfully passed the literacy test, so they were able to register. And that doesn't mean they were actually able to cast a ballot, right? Passing the literacy test is just the first step. But Clark's ideas grew very rapidly. By 1961, there were 37 schools on the Sea Islands in South Carolina. But really what grew Clark's influence in the citizenship school system, right, attempting to train adults to read and write so that they can register to vote, was taken upon by King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So in 1961, Clark joined the SCLC. She was actually one of the few women who was part of the executive board of the SCLC, and was able to spread these citizenship schools throughout the South. And the SCLC program of citizenship schools that Clark came up with, that she founded, was the most successful of that organization's attempts to register voters. King had called her many times, actually, the mother of the movement for her work in this. And in all parts of the long civil rights movement, women were at the forefront of the planning, fundraising, organizing, marching, and documenting, doing the day-to-day work of making the movement successful. The famous Montgomery Bus Boycott, for instance, grew out of a very long struggle led largely by working-class Black women, most of whom were employed as domestics in white people's homes, and most of whom relied on the buses to get to work. The buses were necessary for getting to their places of employment, yet on them, Black women endured disdain, abuse, and sexual harassment from white bus drivers. Joanne Robinson, who was a professor of English at Alabama State University, an HBCU, was a leader in organizing women in Montgomery. After arriving to the city in 1950, she took over leadership of an organization known as the Women's Political Council, a civil rights group that attempted to register voters and challenge white authorities. And she herself had been kicked off of a Montgomery bus for refusing to sit in the back section, and organized Montgomery's women to oppose the discrimination they faced on public transportation. So following the Brown v. Board decision, Robinson decided to actually threaten a boycott of the city's buses in 1954. After the arrest of Claudette Colvin, who was a 10th grader who did not give up her seat on a city bus, Robinson organized some of the women in the WPC into a boycott. And Robinson really wanted to support Colvin's case, particularly after she pled innocent to the charges laid against her. Yet the local NAACP leadership did not attempt to stage a protest after Colvin's arrest. They didn't feel that Colvin was the appropriate candidate to publicize her case. Why? Because Colvin was an unwed pregnant teenager. Even though Robinson and the women in Montgomery wanted to support her, the NAACP leadership had decided not to. And of course, as we know, 8 months later, Rosa Parks put to use the lessons she had learned from Septima Clark and was arrested under similar circumstances as Colvin. and then we get the beginnings of the organization of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And the first person to organize the boycott following Parks's arrest was, of course, Joanne Robinson. On December 2nd, 1955, a day after Parks's arrest, she called on the women of the WPC to institute a boycott for that Monday. And using Alabama State University's photocopiers, she printed 52,500 flyers announcing the boycott and went around town distributing news of the boycott. That Monday, despite the rain, the boycott was a success. But at the end of the day, Robinson learned that the Montgomery Improvement Association had been founded without her, and that King had been elected its president. And in a speech that night at Holt Street Baptist Church, King hailed Parks as a fine citizen and Christian, characterizing her as unassuming. And Parks, despite appearing in front of the crowd of mostly women gathered in the church, was not invited to speak that night. From then on, historian Danielle McGuire argues, Parks's image as the silent, tired old woman overshadowed the lifelong activist. The necessary myth overshadowed the history. There's many examples of other women in the movement who refused to be eclipsed, and perhaps the best known is Ella Baker. Ella Baker was born and raised in the South, but came of age in the New Deal era in New York. She involved herself in the cooperative movement in her local branch of the NAACP, and was a quarter of a century older. She was 25 years older than King. She was an experienced organizer, and that's why the SCLC had recruited her to help them establish their organization. As you probably well know, famously, Baker and King disagreed on their styles of leadership for the SCLC, which led to Baker revitalizing the movement through her work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. SNCC was formed in 1960 with funds from King's organization, and a whole new generation of leaders, including John Lewis and Diane Nash, came of age under Baker's tutelage in SNCC in particular. And SNCC focused on direct action, sit-ins and freedom rides, as well as voter registration drives in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. And in registering voters, SNCC attracted the attention of people like a Mississippian sharecropper, Fannie Lou Hamer. Hamer had suffered physical and emotional violence in her home in the Mississippi Delta. During a hospital visit in 1961, she woke from a procedure to have a cyst removed from her stomach to find that she had been subjected to forced sterilization, an unfortunately common fate for many Black and Latino women during the 20th century. Hamer became involved with SNCC after hearing about their voter registration drive and was able to pass the literacy test there on her third try. She joined SNCC and became a field organizer and endured significant physical and sexual violence in retaliation for her work registering other African Americans in Mississippi. On June 3rd, 1963, as she was returning from a bus trip to attend a citizenship school in Charleston, Hamer and the other travelers were arrested in Mississippi. June Johnson, Annelle Ponder, and Hamer were beaten. Hamer was sidelined for over a month due to her injuries and bore lifelong damage to her kidney as a result of the beating. Her jailers also attempted to strip her by repeatedly pulling her dress over her head. For Hamer and other Black women who dared to register to vote or to support civil rights, violent retaliation from whites often involved sexualized degradation, assault, and rape. Like Reese Taylor, Fannie Lou Hamer chose to testify to the violence that she had endured. And very famously, at the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, Hamer attended as a candidate for Congress. She described the assault that she had received while in jail, and other organizers that had also endured the freedom struggle in Mississippi, what they had experienced. And she described in detail the beating and sexual violations she had endured the previous year. She described as well her loss of employment after registering to vote, and an attempted assassination attempt in which 16 shots were fired into a neighbor's home, which were intended for her. So while I've mainly focused my attention on the earlier parts of the long civil rights movement, I'd like to end by suggesting continuities with the extension of civil rights into the 1970s. So Hall's call to examine this long civil rights movement also rests on refuting the idea of declension after the assassination of King. Rather than suggesting the civil rights movement ended with King's death, Hall points us to the growth of grassroots organizing in the long process of dismantling school segregation and workplace discrimination throughout the 1970s. And these groups tended to focus on coalition building across racial, gendered, and class divides, often invoking third world liberation and anti-imperialism. And furthermore, there's very recent work by historians like Ashley Farmer suggesting the important roles women played in the Black Power movements as well throughout the 70s. So I'd like to end by talking about the Combahee River Collective, who issued a statement in 1977. And the collective was a group of Black feminist lesbian leaders who organized in Boston, and many of them had very long and storied experiences with the civil rights movement, with the feminist movement. It included people like Barbara Smith, Audre Lorde, Shirlane McRae, among other participants. And they reflected on the exclusion they had experienced due to their race, sex, and sexuality during these struggles. And they wrote, "It was our experience and disillusionment within these liberation movements, as well as experience on the periphery of the white male left, that led to the need to develop a politics that was anti-racist, unlike those of white women, and anti-sexist, unlike those of Black and white men." And soon after the issuance of this statement, in fact 3 years later, legal theorist Kimberly Crenshaw would name a similar set of concerns, which of course she named intersectionality. The Combahee River Collective statement was written at the tail end of the long civil rights movement, but suggests a framework for understanding gendered experiences of the civil rights struggle. As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor notes in her recent book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, that the leadership of the modern movement is comprised of queer women of color is not so much a rupture as a continuance of the leadership of Black women in 20th century civil rights struggles. In examining the histories of women in civil rights, we might ask ourselves whose stories we know, whose we don't, and for what purposes were the stories we do know constructed. As historians continue to heed Jacqueline Dowd Hall's call to study the history of the long civil rights movement, more scholarship will continue to enrich our understanding of this crucial time period in American history and help us probe more deeply into contemporary struggles for equity.
Thanks a lot, Mary. Our next speaker is Professor Tim Vivian. The title of his presentation is War, What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. A reflection on Beyond Vietnam by Martin Luther King, Jr. Dr. Tim Vivian is a professor of religious studies at CSUB, whose teaching field is Western religions. His field of research is early Christianity, with a focus on early Christian monasticism. In October, he will receive an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree from the Church Divinity School of the Pacific for his work as a scholar and as an advocate for inclusion, equality, peace, and justice. Congratulations. This semester, his Christianity class read and discussed the works of Martin Luther King, Jr.
The title of my paper is stolen from a not civil rights, but an anti-war song in the late 60s. It's on YouTube. Check it out. History, at least history within a person's lived memory, is personal, as Professor Henry powerfully reminded us. My father's ancestors owned slaves. My father's father was a virulent and venomous racist. As a retired Texas Ranger, he bragged about killing Negras and Mexicans, as he called them. In South Texas, I once saw my ancestors' graveyard. Tombstones of the white folks, tall and erect, stood in the center. Anonymous slabs of weathered rock marked the burial places of the slaves and Jim Crow denizens on the perimeter. I remember the segregated swimming pool near the home of my mother's parents in Austin. All of these are memory and history. Today we commemorate the assassination and martyrdom of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We should have this commemoration every year. We need this commemoration every year. As Jason Sokol wrote recently, King's legacy had, by 2016, become thoroughly sanitized. Commemorate from Latin means remember together. Today we gather together to remember, but we gather together also to bear witness. We gather together to carry on Dr. King's vision of love, nonviolence, and peacemaking. Sí, se puede. As the Black Lives Matter movement, as the Me Too movement, as the March for Our Lives movement, each and all show we need to act. As Dr. King memorably reminds us, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. The first 5 weeks of this semester in my Christianity class, we read, reflected on, and discussed selections from A Testament of Hope, the essential writings and speeches of Martin Luther King. It's an excellent book, allowing us to follow Dr. King and the movement from its earliest days to the night before his assassination in Memphis in 1968. In his final speech that evening, King prophetically proclaimed that he had seen the promised land. Martin was indeed our Moses. Black and brown, white and Asian, we are his children. As his sorrowing children, we buried him. As grandchildren who care, we must carry on his legacy. A Testament of Hope is excellent, but it has one glaring omission. It does not include Dr. King's prophetic speech beyond Vietnam. Lived history, as I said, is personal. I am a child of the war in Vietnam. My teenage years were the years the Beatles rocked the world. But from the age of 13 to the age of 23, I also lived beneath the ever more towering and terrorizing shadow of war. In fact, if you count the Cold War, our country has essentially been at war my whole lifetime, my entire lifetime. Beyond Vietnam is my history, but beyond Vietnam is your history. Beyond Vietnam is our history. It breaks my heart to say it, but I know that in my lifetime, we will never be beyond Vietnam. In our illicit and immoral assault on Iraq, we may have killed 500,000 people. As I speak, we are waging war in 2 countries. The war in Afghanistan, with no end in sight, has now lasted longer than the war in Vietnam. Daily, war gnaws away at our national soul. It's hard to say it, and I'm sure Dr. King would be happy if it were not true, but his speech beyond Vietnam is still powerfully and awfully relevant. The 2019 budget proposal from the White House calls for $716 billion in defense spending. It will increase Pentagon spending by more than 7% over the 2018 budget. The plan also calls for major cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and other social programs. This budget, if enacted, will cut $554 billion from Medicare spending over 10 years. It will make the biggest reduction in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, the food stamp program. The plan also calls for major cuts, as I've said, to Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and other social programs. Do we hear the most important word in that sentence? No, it's not Medicare, Medicaid, or food stamps. It's not even major cuts. No, the most important and devastating word in that sentence is also. In other words, the entitled and larcenous children of obese military spending, both now and as adults, will rob and plunder our social programs, especially those programs for people in need. President Lyndon Johnson and the rest of the country discovered during the war in Vietnam that you can't bloat and pump up the defense budget like a hot air balloon without eviscerating social programs. In the 19th century, Mark Twain popularized the saying, lies, damn lies, and statistics. The Trump budget proposal is all three. But statistics do matter. In Kern County, 22% of the population, more than 850,000 people, live below the poverty line. 28% of our children live in poverty. 40% of our adults are food insecure. In 2013, Bakersfield was the most illiterate city in the country, and Kern County the most illiterate county. These numbers rocket the mind, but we must always remember, always, that each number is a human being, alive and breathing, and often hurting. By this point, you may think I'm belaboring this, or that I'm way off topic. But these ugly facts bring us back to beyond Vietnam. King gave this speech in 1967. In 2018, we're reliving it. The war in Vietnam helped destroy Lyndon Johnson's and America's dream of a great society. The dream of a great society free from injustice and oppression, poverty and hunger. If LBJ was the king and Israel the people, then MLK was the prophet Amos. Amos rebukes his people. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground, and deny justice to the oppressed. Our current wars in Syria and Afghanistan, the recent budget passed by Congress that takes from the poor and gives to the rich, and the proposed 2019 budget are destroying what little greatness our society has left. Hear what Martin Luther King declared 51 years ago in Beyond Vietnam. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in the struggle for equality. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam. And I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw people and skills and money, like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Not incidentally, King lost a good deal of his supporters, black and white, because of that speech, including Johnson. War is always the enemy of the poor. Instead of Vietnam, supply Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan, and now perhaps Iran and North Korea. President Trump's decision to send more troops to Afghanistan will add billions of dollars a year to the already towering war costs, which have topped $1 trillion in Afghanistan alone. And the government will still be paying for war veterans' health care costs for at least another half century. Dr. King continues, Now, it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. America's soul can never be saved so long as it destroys the hopes of people all over the world. King presciently tells us that the war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. What is that malady? As I see it, that affliction is the four horsemen of the American apocalypse: solipsistic nationalism, militarism, consumerism, and hyper-individualism. Martin Luther King tells us about the poisoning of the American soul. Today, our souls and our hearts and minds need intensive care. So, and I ask myself this question every day: how do we not become totally disillusioned, hiding away in the Cold War bunkers of our homes? In 1967, the organization Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam reminded all of us, a time comes when silence is betrayal. That statement is cautionary, but it can also be invigorating. It challenges us to get off our asses and do something. If our souls are being poisoned, and I believe they are, we are both the patients and we are the nurses and doctors working hard to restore our very souls. King called his vocation, quote, a vocation of agony, unquote. In classical Greek, an agon, from which we get agony, was an athletics term, a contest or game in an arena. Later, it came to mean any struggle, trial, or danger. By the time of early Christian monasticism in the 4th century, early monastics used athletic metaphors to describe spiritual struggle, engagement. Whatever our profession or creed, we today are in a spiritual struggle for our lives. And not just for our lives, but the lives of millions of beloved human beings in the United States and beloved sisters and brothers around the world. Martin Luther King prophetically taught us this 50 years ago. Now, made in his image and likeness, we need to teach ourselves first and then all others. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Okay, there is coffee. Okay, the next speaker is Dr. Rhonda Dugan. The title of her presentation is MLK's Message in Contemporary Popular Culture. Dr. Rhonda Dugan is an associate professor of sociology at California State University, Bakersfield, where she has been a faculty member since 2005. Dr. Dugan graduated with a BA and MA in sociology from Illinois State University and earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her teaching and research interests focus on race, ethnicity, and gender, as well as Black identity, culture, and popular culture. As a professor at CSUB, she has taught a number of undergraduate and graduate courses, including Introduction to Sociology, Research Methods, Race and Ethnic Relations, Diversity and Research Ethics, Qualitative Research Methods, Gender and Society, the African American Experience, Cultural Sociology, popular culture, sociology of film, sociology of the family, and senior seminar. Dr. Dugan is currently working on a research project with a sociology colleague, Dana Rasmussen, interviewing college students about their use/non-use and interpretation of the N-word in the post-civil rights era.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It may seem that my topic is a little more frivolous than the previous panelists, but I'm here to argue that understanding MLK's legacy through representation in popular culture is significant. So if anyone's questioning that, I will provide some context about that. So, and these are just some of the ideas that I'm entertaining with, and being asked to be part of this panel, I'm actually thinking about making this into a particular project based on what I discuss here today. So, there are numerous examples of how Martin Luther King's legacy has been represented in popular culture through, particularly focusing on through a historical lens, whether it's through art, particularly if you go to urban areas across the country, there's often murals that represent MLK and other leaders. So art is one way to portray his legacy. Without a doubt, film and television, Selma in 2014, and numerous television miniseries such as King in 1978, HBO's Boycott in 2011, and even on Broadway, The Mountaintop, which Samuel L. Jackson interestingly portrayed MLK. So quite a switch if you're familiar with some of his work. Also, in terms of music, MLK's legacy has been represented if you are familiar with U2's Pride in the Name of Love, which was written for MLK, or Stevie Wonder's hit Happy Birthday. I don't know how many people are familiar with that song, but that song was written by Wonder in 1981 as a way to campaign for the MLK holiday, which started in 1986. And as a side note, it seems to be the unofficial birthday song in Black communities across the United States, particularly if you live in urban areas on radio stations. So those are just some of the numerous examples of how King's socio-historical legacy has been represented in popular culture. And so before I get into the specifics of my talk, I want to provide some context as to what popular culture is. I think common sense understandings often see it as something that's frivolous or not meaningful, but I'm here to make the argument, as well as many other sociologists and scholars, that's looking at popular culture through a sociological lens is particularly important. So there are a number of ways, and drawing on the work of sociologist David Grazian, he argues that typical understandings of popular culture are these aesthetic products that are created, often seeking only to make a profit, right? So if we think of movies, etc. So in reflecting on this common sense understanding, he's provided an extended framework, if you will, in understanding the different ways that we can understand what popular culture is and what does it mean to be popular, right? So one is, he argues that to be popular is to be well-liked, and in particular in commercial success. So for instance, if you, just yesterday the news came out that Black Panther is the highest grossing, movie, domestically, it's the fourth highest ever, and globally it's earned $1.2 billion. So one could make an argument that it's popular in terms of commercial success. Popular and popular culture can also refer to looking at iconic individuals and celebrities, right? So we can think of MLK as an iconic figure in popular culture, right, based on some of the examples I've just given. But also it could include celebrities who they are popular because they're well known, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're liked, right? And so often you see examples of like Kardashian, Jenner, individuals in that discussion. Another way of thinking of popular culture is commercial media, right? That's sort of for the masses, where creations might be considered banal, tacky, ordinary, reality TV falls into that category. Another aspect of popular culture that is something that creations that belong to the people, particularly with music, such as the aforementioned examples that I've listed. So music genres like rap, folk, blues, R&B, soul, country reflect issues that are often in communities regarding class, race, protest music, and also reflects the authenticity of the group or the music that's being presented. And so lastly, Grazing argues that large-scale media events can also be popular if they reach an audience at one moment in time. And so, live events such as the recent NCAA Final Four, right, on Monday, award shows, which you had mentioned, right, presidential addresses, anything that's, shown live, whether on television or streamed online. And so it's this last particular aspect of popular culture, this large-scale media event, is what I want to focus on for the rest of my talk. That relates to a commercial that was aired during Super Bowl 52. If anyone is familiar with the Chrysler Dodge Ram commercial, that was aired just before halftime of the game, in which the commercial used actual sermon from MLK's, one of his last sermon actually at Ebenezer Baptist Church on February 4th. So I want to take some time and discuss that. So if you haven't seen the ad did air on Sunday, February 4th, 2018, just before halftime. It was an ad about a minute long, which was approved, interestingly, by King's estate. And so, but it was not supported by the King Center. And unfortunately, this struggle and debate is represented by the children of MLK, where Bernice King, who has been operating the center, has been at odds with her brother Dexter, who operates and maintains the estate. And so the estate agreed and allowed Chrysler to use elements of the sermon, which I'll talk about in a moment, sort of as the background of this ad. So if you have not seen the ad's about a minute long, and the imagery is very powerful. It shows what you would say everyday, ordinary Americans doing volunteer service, also using the Ram truck, right? So, and in good ways, whether it's after a natural disaster, if it's helping to build houses, there's imagery of teachers in schools and veterans coming home, greeting their children, and that's sort of the imagery with, that's the backdrop of the context of MLK's sermon, which was taken from, it's called The Drum Major Instinct. And since we don't have visuals, I did print out exactly what was said in that ad, and bear with me, I don't have any, I won't try to read it like he did, that would be a great injustice. So the background of the commercial says, if you want to be important, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is the greatest among you shall be your servant. That's a new definition of greatness. By giving that definition of greatness, it means that everybody can be great. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know the theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. So those were the excerpts of the sermon that is used in this ad. And so, as many of you know, one of the legacies of King's work is this idea of doing service, right? And, working in beloved communities and, giving your time. So as I was digging more into finding out more information about this ad and, sort of questioning in my head, is this appropriate to use a sermon of King's to sell a product? Because that's what we're talking about here. I also found out that Dodge RAM has this group called Ram Nation, which focuses on individuals who are Dodge truck Ram owners who go out and volunteer in the community. And so because of that extended arm of Chrysler, that was why they selected this particular quote and ad, right? And I think that's something that most people did not know, and I did not know that as I was digging deeper into this. And so the use of King's sermon, and if you go to the website, it has also, some of the quotes from his sermon as well. So these Ram truck owners volunteer their time after natural disasters, helping with veterans, build houses, what have you. And so that was the justification of using that ad. So what I find particularly important about where Chrysler selected this quote is from the Drum Major Instinct, which interestingly was King's final sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church on the same date 50 years ago. So there is, if nothing else, it was a brilliant strategy on the part of Chrysler to sort of match the dates up in the Super Bowl, right? So that's something that's interesting. But what's most ironic is the premise of the Drum Major Instinct and what King was putting forth in that sermon. So briefly, generally speaking, the premise was that King argued that in your desire to be a leader, right, to commit to doing service, it should be humbled and done truly to help others and not to do for ego boost or recognition. So like a drum major who leads a parade, right, and sort of moving the parade down the street, he was presenting this idea that if you're going to lead, do it out of humbleness, right? And he makes the argument, and it's a very powerful one, and some of the critiques that Professor Vivian was talking about in his talk, he provides extensive critique of classism, racism, nationalism, militarism, and even talks about nuclear bombs, right, that Russia can drop on the United States. And at a minimum, he says, this type of approach of thinking of service, he says, can lead to snobbish exclusivism. So I think it's quite interesting that taken out of context, that quote of the commercial, it does represent King, but when you dig a little deeper and actually read the entire sermon, which I've done a few times, it seems to contradict very much what Chrysler's trying to do and sell a product. I think, what's the funniest of all, and there's a quote where King even mentions Chrysler in his critique, where he says, but very seriously, it goes through life. The drum major instinct is real, and you know what else it causes to happen. It often causes us to live above our means. It's nothing but the drum major instinct. Do you ever see people buy cars that can't even begin to buy in terms of their income? And he laughs, and he says, you've seen people riding around in Cadillacs and Chryslers who don't earn enough to have a good T-model Ford. So I don't know. At the same time, the brilliance of linking the date together, I think at the same time, whoever was in charge missed some of those aspects. So if you haven't had a chance to read The Drum Major Instinct, it's a very fascinating sermon. And what's also interesting is that he gives, I don't know if it's a premonition or how you would interpret it, but King also talks about what he would like to be said at his funeral, and in regard to this idea of having served. And he provides a quote at the end that he doesn't want to be remembered for winning awards and a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be remembered that he had served, right, humbly. So with all this being said, it does raise some questions that I don't necessarily have the answers for, and I'm not arguing for or against the use of King's legacy in order to sell a product in commercialization. But, it does raise a question, should his legacy or quotes, sermons, etc., be used in commercialization to sell a product? Right? That's something that I think has to be considered. However, if you look at the other end of the debate, and as my co-panelists have eloquently presented, despite that aspect of commercialization, does this ad help to still maintain that awareness, particularly with younger generations who might think that this is a long time ago, right? It's not important anymore. And so it's possible that even, our people move to do service, as well as does this continue his legacy despite it being used in commercial ways? So those are some of the questions that I've raised. I necessarily don't have answers to, but I hope that's something that we can discuss here, and just kind of putting the idea out here and looking at that relationship. Particularly, I'm intrigued about the commercialization aspect. Even if King's estate has approved the use of his sermons, is that good? Right. So I will leave it there at that, and hopefully we can have some discussion about that. So thank you.
Okay, there will be a fire drill, but I think we can use a few minutes for question and answer. Any question, any comment, or?
Working. Thanks for a great panel. And my question is this. I lived through the civil rights period where I was an undergraduate student in the late 60s and 70s, and on every campus on this country, the students took to the street and they protested. It was a big grassroots movement across the country. We were mad about the Vietnam War, so on TV every night there would be pictures of the Vietnam War, and we just made us madder and madder and madder because they showed the battles on TV. They don't do that anymore, but it just aggravated us all. We were really mad about equal rights, and we were really mad about civil rights. But what we did was we organized, and we had peaceful protests like all over the country. Many students went down and marched with King, and it was really impactful. I really felt that we had some influence on where the country was going. What came out of that? Not what we wanted. We did get Title IX passed, we got Civil Rights Act passed, but unbelievably, we couldn't get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. And we couldn't get 38 states in the country to say, my rights are the same as yours, I'm equal to you. Now that is really sad. So then I thought we were really making progress, that when I entered the workforce, affirmative action was in play, and that was supposed to provide us all access to employment, equal access to employment. And it sort of happened, but then in the 80s, everything sort of quieted down. Nothing really happened, and we actually started reverting back to, practices that don't support equal rights for everybody. We really believed in what Martin Luther King said, which was he had a vision for the future, that we could all work together and respect each other no matter what our color or race or anything was. It was just really a powerful message. My question is, we need that again. I'm inspired by Me Too and Black Lives Matters, but we need a big grassroots movement in the country to bring back the focus to these issues, because they're still there. And so I hadn't marched for, I don't know, since, 40 years, and I went and marched in the Women's Bakersfield March. They thought they were going to have 100 or 200 people show up. They had thousands of people showing up, all different shapes, sizes, from every part of the community. And you know what? I'm hopeful about that. But don't you think that we need a big civil rights movement again, like we had in the 60s and 70s? We made a few steps forward to get to further down the road, because we aren't there yet. That's my question.
After the election, the presidential election, my daughter, who's 30, emailed me or called me, I can't remember, and she called me. And I told her I was too depressed, I couldn't even talk about it now. But I said, and give me a week or 2 weeks. By that time, I was encouraged by what I was hearing from people who said, look, we're not going to take this. And I'm especially encouraged, even knowing Congress will do nothing, about the March for Our Lives. Teaching young people, I'm encouraged by the millennials. I think they're getting it. So I do have real hope coming up that these millennials and the younger folks are going to push us to do something.
If I may, I'm a simple-minded person. The answer to your question, my former dean, is yes. We need a larger movement. We can pay lip service all we want. We can pat our millennials on the head. We can sit back and say, yeah, Congress isn't going to do anything about that. No offense. We need to get up off our asses and do something. We up here need to empower those millennials, our students on this campus, and anybody else that will listen to facilitate change. So yes, it needs to happen. The question is, how do we make it happen?
Interestingly enough, I had a discussion about this issue with Professor Santos of sociology, and I was telling him I want to have a march under the title March of the 21st Century, Chapter 1. This march is not just simply about specific issues, but we should have a multi-dimensional approach in which all kinds of social problems are discussed. But I was telling him that, I'm a social theorist. I don't know how this thing is done. Maybe he can help me, I was telling him. So, yeah, we should have, we should act. We should demonstrate. We should be actively involved in this kind of process. Most of the time, we spend our time on entertaining ourselves about this issue, that particular moment that has taken place. We always say, did you see that? It was on this part, and then instead of really, we are concerned about these issues, but we are not acting. So we have to go beyond entertaining ourselves. We should be actively involved in the processes of collective action. Any other question or comment?
Just one quick observation. I think there's a number of movements right now, and I think the biggest challenge to answer how is to find the thread that connects them all. And I think that's the issue. I think there's movements going on, whether it's virtual, online, or, marches that we even see locally, nationally, or globally. I think some of that fragmentation has prevented to see the connection. And I think with the high school students with Parkland, and it's interesting to look at discussions of talking about gun violence when there have been students of color making these arguments about gun violence in their communities for years, right? And so it seems like it's starting to inch a little bit closer. So I think the how part is to start recognizing how these issues, which seem very disparate, are actually very much interconnected, and how some voices are discounted, but others are deeply counted. And it's not to discount what those teens at Parkland have done, but there's a big puzzle that's missing there that they, to their credit, have given some awareness to, but I think that's the issue, that there's so many different movements that seem different, but they're really addressing a larger, similar issue.
My name is Patricia, and I have the privilege of sitting in Dr. Tim Vivian's class, Christianity. So I had this thick book, Testament of Hope, that he referred to, with all of the speeches and lectures and interviews by Dr. King. And he chose the ones that were most pertinent to our topic for that. And all of us were just gobsmacked by the depth and the brilliance of that man. He quotes the old philosophers, the new philosophers. He was an awesome, awesome guy. And through that class, by the way, is full of upper division great students. Thank you, Cal State. And I want to say the topic of his talk was war, What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Ooh! Remember that? You old folks? We at St. Paul's Episcopal are having a dream rally this coming Saturday at 7, and one of the posters I'm making for that dream rally at Yokitz Park says, and I'm quoting Martin Luther King III from a television interview last week. Martin Luther King said there are 3 evils we must avoid, eradicate. 1 is racism, 2 is militarism, and 3 is, do you remind me, King? Nope. Hello, anybody remember? Well, I'll tell you later. Anyhow, there's 3 evils that he said are cultural that we need to eradicate. The third one, anyhow, I just want to invite you to come out and join us Saturday to celebrate DACA, Martin Luther King Jr., all kinds of injustices that continue to occur. And we need to all eradicate. Oh, I know what I was going to say, not the third one. There's a video I just watched, and in the video, this young group is singing, and they say, God, there's all kinds of things going on bad in the world. Do something. And God said, I did something. I made you. Now do something.
The event at Yokitz on Saturday starts at 10.
Thank you, Ken.
You have any comment on that? Oh.
Can I just add an
Okay,
observation
go ahead.
too? Yeah. So first, I just wanted to thank you. I learned so much from this and was inspired and glad that this is how I'm spending my morning. Thank you for that. You know, this piece about all these different movements and as we're sort of working our way and trying to figure out how to bring them together, keep those intersectional pieces really up front. I'm finding the Mobilize Kern Facebook page helpful, and knowing that there are like 1,000+ people here in town who are working in disparate ways and putting things out, you know, whatever their particular issue is, and putting the call out and asking people to come join, and just having that shared space. So Mobilize Kern Facebook, I find as one sort of actual virtual, but then people coming together in all of these variety of issues. So I just wanted to raise that up.
Good morning. I want to thank our panelists as well for getting us, getting us off to a great start with our program. CSUB celebrates the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. There are several other events planned for today, but certainly this was the right way to get it started. And so I appreciate each of you, and Dr. Combahee as the moderator. I appreciate each of your presentations. And when we look at them collectively and we start talking about what are the threads that run between activities and organizations and movements, you begin to give us a sense about that. And as long as we can think about that and share ideas about it, I think we can move closer to what we need to be doing. So thank you very much.
Okay, again, a reminder that this is not the only event. We have this afternoon, we'll watch a video on the civil rights movement as well as Dr. King, and then we'll have a group discussion as well. And then it's going to be, that's on 2 o'clock. And then that will be followed 4 o'clock. We will be reading a letter from Birmingham City Jail by Martin Luther King. And the most important event tonight is 6 o'clock. The President, Dr. Mitch, and Dr. Wallace will be the keynote speakers at that time, and at the same time I will provide very brief background information on the nature of the civil rights movement in general and the role of Martin Luther King in particular. Okay.
I want to thank everyone here for making it what it is. I was very impressed with Martin Luther King from the very beginning. I was working in Watts when he was killed, and I had a honeymoon right after that with my wife 50 years ago. He's sitting here in front. But I want to make sure, not whitewashing anything, a note of optimism is needed. He was an optimist. He was full of hope. He had a strength and experience with God himself, that he was guided, that he was inspired. But he gave us a vision of hope. And I think if we go back, we'll see that this has happened. An illustrious president of the university, Black American origin. Previous to that, a Latino president of the university. Title IX of the civil rights movement, or civil rights law, enabled a lot of women to rise, mostly actually white women to rise and get where they are today. You can look around, and of all colors. I'm not whitewashing anything. Just to know that there is hope, and there has been a lot going on. I carry a political, philosophical discussion with my sons on the internet through texting, and one is decrying how things are going bad, the world is just going down the tube. And then we have a son, my youngest, bringing out the great advances across the world in poverty, education. So let's remember, we need to maintain that hope, just like he did. He died a martyr, just like Gandhi. He was one of the great ones. I thank Dr. Vivian for introducing us to this illustrious saint, martyr, philosopher, prophet. Gave us this hope. A Black American president. I mean, there's still hope, people. There's still hope. And he would have been our president by acclamation. There's no doubt in my mind. I honor his memory, and I honor all those who have honored him today. I say this very humbly. Thank you.
Yes, Martin Luther King Jr. was an optimist. We have in his message, there is a message of hope. And at the same time, he was also aware of what is going on. He could be described as a pessimist optimist. He was not blind with respect to what is happening, but at the same time, he strongly believed that with collective action, change can come. So with Martin Luther King, you see a demonstration of what we call in sociology the dialectics of agency and structure. There are structural processes, but at the same time there are also agents who are actively involved in the processes of reinforcing as well as changing the structural processes that we have. Thank you for the comment that you have made. Any other comment or question?
Dr. Vivian alluded to this. My question is how we use the imagery of war to disenfranchise, disempower, or defund minority groups.
How we do it?
Yes.
The imagery. Wow. I have to think about that. I mean, it's clear from what I've said that I think the rampant militarization of this country, if we don't do something about that, everything else is screwed. It's just sucking the soul out of this country. It really is. And with the nomination of Bolton, and as King pointed out, it destroys social programs. Instead of putting billions of dollars in war, let's put them in our social programs. That's the best I can do right now, sorry.
Thank you.
Let's have a break at this point. Okay, so we will have question and answer again. If you have any question, not just simply a question, but if you have any comment, remark that you'd like to make, you are most welcome. You can use that microphone right there.
As you have mentioned, we've been in a war for 16 years in Afghanistan, and during Martin Luther King's time, there was great opposition to the war in Vietnam, and yet I see no opposition to this war whatsoever. And my question is, what can we do to raise the awareness in people so that there will be a movement, or people will move out to stop this war?
Well, the flip answer is reinstitute the draft. That'll get the students out there, right? Yes. I mean, the reality is that the protests in the 60s, I'm not sure they made any difference. Because Nixon got in and increased the bombing and bombed Laos and Cambodia. I mean, it got worse. I remember reading years ago, I'm sorry guys, this just eats me alive. So, that the military-industrial complex, if you've never read Dwight Eisenhower's warning about it, Google it. Dwight Eisenhower, the leader of our armed forces in World War II. His departing speech was to warn about what he called the military-industrial complex. And that would be now at least probably 65 years ago or something. 60 years ago. Where was I? Oh, that every congressional representative district, except at that time, I think 2, I'm not exaggerating, had a military contract. So that's the way they've done it. They've lobbied the Congress people, just like, sorry, the NRA does. And it's, what's the metaphor I want? It's an octopus. Like Frank Norris's novel in the 19th century about the railroads. It's in every congressional district. And even the so-called liberals just keep voting for all the defense spending. They don't want to be perceived as unpatriotic. I just hope and pray it doesn't take a disaster like Iran or North Korea to change us, but it may. I'm sorry, but... By the way, since we are doing Q&A, I left out of mine, my father was a fighter-bomber pilot in World War II, so I have even more connection with war. He was shot down over France, rescued by the resistance, and smuggled to Sweden, where they had a prisoner exchange. And he would never talk about the war. The one thing I remember, I don't know if he ever said anything more than this, was every time he went up in a formation, there were 3. He said one of you wasn't coming back every time. And so I did see his yearbook from the war, and he just pointed out all the guys he'd lost. So, even though my father was a career military man, he was not a gung-ho warrior because he knew better. And, since we're doing King, the thing about the military, as King pointed out, and it's true today, is how disproportionately it is made up of minorities.
Poor people.
I can't remember the numbers from Vietnam, but blacks were killed in much higher percentages than whites were during that war. Again, as with everything in this country, there's a racist component to it. There really is. Would things be better if Clinton had won? I think at least on the saber rattling, it would be. But Clinton backed the Iraq War or the Iraq invasion. So even Obama, huge fan of Obama. Obama I found very disappointing on these issues. So I'm really not hopeful. I mean, hope, I agree, we need hope, but on this one issue, I'm sorry, I'm just not hopeful.
So writing to our congressman would make a change, huh?
The congressman who's never here, that one, who avoids meetings.
I think another thing we might consider too are the ways in which the buildup of the military-industrial complex affects domestic issues, particularly the militarization of police, right? So this is an issue Black Lives Matter has worked on pretty extensively. And I think in building their broad-scale coalition, they have also been very critical of American foreign policy, and in particular imperial policy. But that particular issue of the militarization of what's happening domestically is, I think, pretty central to what they're trying to accomplish. And I think if we want to see examples of the effectiveness of mobilization of Black Lives Matter, we just have to look a bit north to Sacramento, right? The protests shutting down I-5, in the protests after the death of Stephen Clark just a week ago, right, is a really good example of what they've been able to accomplish, right here in California.
Opposition against war is really a tricky business because of a number of reasons. Because in this case, for example, American soldiers are involved in the process. And most of the time, when you are against war, people automatically assume that you are not patriotic enough, that you are against your country, when actually in reality you are not. Dr. King had to pass through that kind of criticism. He was vilified for opposing the Vietnam War. But actually he did it out of love for his country. He was not trying to undermine the United States. He was just simply, the message as we have heard today is that if you just spend that kind of money, that kind of resource on war, definitely you are draining the economy, and at the same time it does have a negative impact on what is going on here. So war is really problematic. It extends itself. Whatever happens in other parts of the world, and then it's going to have an impact on what is happening here as well. But I think we have to be very systematic in terms of bringing to the attention of people why war is not a good thing, why war is not the solution. So we have to talk about those things. Any other comment? I want to have a discussion about, please.
I have remembered my third point, and with his help, it's a 3A and B. The third one was, first was racism, second one was militarism, and the third one was violence. And he added poverty. And what did you add, Sarah? Okay. To Dr. Vivian's point about our social issues being robbed of funding, I am heartened by the teachers who are walking out by the thousands in Oklahoma and Virginia and everywhere else. They don't have desks, they don't have books, they don't have pay, they don't have what they need to do their the important job of education. And I hope they were emboldened by our high schoolers from Parkland who came out by the millions from everywhere to say, this is wrong. Gun violence has to stop for the high schoolers. And robbing our educational system to give the money elsewhere, like military, is just immoral. Amen.
I actually had a question for Dr. Stango on your talk. I think it's interesting to look at the role of women, and particularly Black women. And, you know, you ended your talk with the 1970s, so I'm going to ask to think about, especially now, I think what's interesting, at least my observations about Black women and activism, there seems to be women who become involved because of a personal act, like, you know, moms where their sons have been shot or their daughters have been shot. So I was kind of curious to see how that fits into this larger sort of socio-historical understanding. So these sort of unexpected leaders that are emerging as opposed to those who are active in organizations.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I know there's been a lot of really interesting discussions about, sort of this precise issue of what does it mean when somebody's child is killed, right? How are they motivated to activism, and what sort of emotional and physical toll does that take, right? Sort of publicizing the death of your child in public forums repeatedly. I think thinking of, sort of historical precursors, who immediately comes to mind is, of course, Mamie Till, right? For people who know the story of Emmett Till, who's a teenage boy lynched in Mississippi, brutally beaten before his death, and his body was recovered, and his mother insisted on an open casket funeral as a result, and actually had Jet magazine take photographs of her son's corpse to show the country what had happened to her son. And I think she gives a really sort of powerful historical antecedent to some of the ways in which women involved in the movement, who have this very personal, intimate connection that propels them into their activism, are engaged in very similar work as a result. And I think, in the cases of some of the women that I talked about as well, like Fannie Lou Hamer, for instance, there's also sort of not the death of a loved one, but violence they experience themselves also motivates them to their action. And there's other sort of examples of that too, like a UNIA member from the 30s, Mittie Maud Lena Gordon, for instance, witnesses a lynching as a child, and that becomes the motivation for her support of Garveyism and sort of ideas about Black separatism. So I think that, there's definitely that historical thread that we see pieces of that emerging in the present too.
Thank you.
There is also this issue, we have to be honest about this. That is the role of women. Women were playing a very critical role, but in spite of the fact that the civil rights movement was very much centered around the philosophy of egalitarianism, women were not really provided the opportunity to be leaders. They were extremely involved in the processes of micro-mobilization. They were acting as bridge leaders, but they were not really allowed to be prominent leaders, to assume very important positions. So that's one of the problems that we had with the civil rights movement.
Yeah, and I think it's something that more contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter, like the Me Too movement, have been really clear in sort of learning from what happened in the 50s and 60s and trying not to repeat that same pattern of sidelining women's voices. Like the March on Washington, for instance, Daisy Bates speaks for, I think, 20 seconds or so during the March on, but right, other than that, women are entirely excluded. Medgar Edgar's widow was supposed to speak, but misses her flight and doesn't end up actually speaking at the March on Washington. But yeah, I think that contemporary activists take those lessons really, really seriously in their organizing as well. And I think that also organizing in the 50s and 60s, led by women, looks different than it does in the SCLC. So like Ella Baker's model of organization and SNCC is not a top-down organization in the way that King's organization is. So I think that there's different ways to be an activist. There's different ways to organize a social movement, and the SCLC isn't the only model for doing that kinds of work. So we can also maybe look to other organizations of the era to see different models for mobilization as well.
Any other comment? I really want to talk about this issue. I have a very strong feeling with respect to the commercial.
Can you speak into the microphone, please?
Okay. Okay. I want to make a comment on the presentation on the commodification of the Martin Luther's message. In my view, I think it's wrong. This is my personal opinion. I mean, I'm not talking as a sociologist here. But from my perspective, should not be used for as I said, purposes of commodification. It's wrong because the message in Martin Luther's, one of the messages that we have here is he was very much against this materialistic approach, and to use I don't know how the state has come up with a decision, but from my perspective, it was very wrong to use it for commercial purposes. I don't know, you can comment on that one.
I know in terms of the estate, Chrysler commented in saying they worked extensively with the estate. I still couldn't find like the roots or to find out what the decision process was to say yes, use elements of the sermon from the drum leader instinct. I guess I'm going to talk about sociologically, right, and then have a personal idea. I think sociologically, I guess I'm torn in some ways because I guess I keep thinking about does this commercial, even if just a little bit in terms of exposure, motivate people to have a different way of thinking, right? Where audiences, and in studies of pop culture, audiences, there's this discussion of whether we're passive or active audience members. And, I would hope that such a commercial that there would be an active response and sort of considering what the message is or what it's about. And I think, again, in the execution of the commercial itself, whether it's right or wrong, I think was pretty potent in many ways, not just matching the date, but also the event in which the commercial, was aired in the Super Bowl, where you have maybe a diverse cross-section of people, or maybe even individuals who might not necessarily be interested in doing the types of service work, right, that King advocated for. So, and I think the imagery, it's unfortunate we couldn't have a screen to show that video because I think it's very powerful image-wise, and I do think that there may have, this would be an empirical question to find out of how much an audience was actually affected by that commercial, to think a little bit more, even to investigate or read up on it. But interestingly, I don't see the commercial anymore, right? So I think it was a one-shot deal, or maybe a couple days after, because there was a lot of criticism, particularly on social media. Twitter just lost its mind, so to speak, in that there were all sorts of people who were condemning using, MLK's message to sell a product, right, to commodify it and commercialize it. But then a few argued and said, well, if it means it has to be done this way to get a message out, who's to say? But I think the interesting dynamic in all of it is considering King's estate that said, go ahead and use their message. That's what I would really want to find out, what the motivations were for that.
Okay, any other last?
I have one more thing to say. On the sculpture to the west side of this library about Martin Luther King Jr., I am encouraged by the quotation next to it. Love is the only force that can make enemies, or friends of enemies. Love is the only force that can make friends of enemies. Love one another.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will conclude here. Thank you for coming.
All right.